All right, this week our special guest is Liz Larsen. I was really looking forward to this because I was hoping that Liz would be able to teach me a little bit about analog video processing, and that's exactly what she did. Now, unfortunately, we were both a little bit under the weather, and we both had kids to deal with, and we recorded this pretty late at night, but I think that the result is pretty fantastic. So I hope you enjoy this podcast. It was a real treat for me to be able to do. And if you're interested at all in the LZX system, that's LZXindustries.net. That's where you'll find more information about it. And you'll also find an awful lot of information about video processing on YouTube, so I strongly suggest you go take a look out there as well. Without further ado. Okay, today we're going to be interviewing a real special guest. It's Liz Larsen, who's one of the owners and design engineers with LZX Industries. LZX Industries is doing some phenomenal work. They are creating modular synthesis pieces, but rather than audio synthesis pieces, they're modular analog video synthesis pieces. I find this stuff amazing. I find that it's such a great mirror of some of the original video artwork that I still find completely entrancing. And I'm really excited to learn more from Liz herself. So, hi Liz, how are you?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you.
Why don't we start this off by having you give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Okay. Well, I've lived here in Texas all my life. I went to film school here. I was in a lot of bands during school, and that led me into synthesizers. Synthesizers led me into electronics, and sort of as I got into electronics, I discovered video art through demo videos that I had found online of Dan Sandine's image processor and other devices from the 60s and 70s. And I got completely obsessed with this stuff, mainly because it seemed like I've always been obsessed with exploration themes and parallel universes. And I felt like I had stumbled upon this little pocket universe that had never quite expanded according to its potential, but rather abandoned. And I got really obsessed with it and educated myself on electronics and built a lot of synthesizers trying to get to a point where I could understand the video signal well enough to begin developing my own devices. And I teamed up with my partner, Ed, and together we've been doing this for about 4 years now.
Interesting. Well, certainly looking on your website, which is LZXindustries.net, the list of modules is pretty amazing. But also coming from a music audio standpoint, some of them are just sort of completely baffling from a functional standpoint. What are some of the sort of unique functions that you have to deal with in terms of doing analog video that sort of had to be extended from the typical analog synthesizer model?
Well, analog video has a lot more in common with an audio signal than it does with any sort of digital video. Analog video, it's a continuous voltage, single voltage across time, the same way that audio is. The main difference, the reason why you can't display audio on a TV and you can video, is that the video signal has instructions embedded into it to tell the TV what to do with the signal that it's receiving. And that's we refer to that as video sync information. So there needs to be pulses at very specific set times inserted into the signal that tell the TV when to start a new frame or when to display a new scan line. the first step in setting up kind of an infrastructure for modular video signal processing is to create an interface by which voltages are inserted, and video sync signals are kind of imposed upon them in a way to where when the signal reaches the television, it displays a stable image, and also, embeds color information and things of that nature.
Sure. Well, I can imagine, and just as you were describing it, what I was imagining was how some of like your early tests must be just incredible messes on the screen.
Absolutely.
So now when you're within the module set, do you work with like a single composite video image, or do you have to work with the colors as separate entities?
There's kind of two formats at play. Inside of the system, the LZX signal standard, everything runs off of DC coupled control voltages, and they're all in the 1 volt signal amplitude range due to bandwidth concerns. But the inside, you have 3 cones in your eye, and that so it takes 3 signals to be able to show you all of the colors. And an arrangement of 3 signals creating a full color image is what we call a color space. By default, the system runs off of the RGB color space and these just standard 1 volt DC coupled signals. And but there are modules which allow you to do analog transformations and access modulating and mixing within color spaces such as YUV color difference and HSY, which stands for hue, saturation, and brightness as well.
Sure. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Now, you say that there's a 1 volt range that's a consideration for bandwidth. How does reducing the voltage range actually improve the bandwidth?
Well,
I'm just curious.
The amount, in order to keep the bandwidth at like a 5 volt or 10 volt scale, and still keep it within video bandwidth, the power consumption demands would be outrageous. And
of course. Okay.
None of the chips designed for video rate bandwidths are going to like being treated that way, or they won't support quite that same signal range.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. So now, one of the things that strikes me when I look at your system and we discuss sort of some of the difficulties or challenges in working with video is that before you could do anything, you sort of had to do almost everything, or at least it seems like it, because you have different voltage standards, because you have these different synchronization and desynchronization mechanisms that had to be in play, and because things were moving around in different sets of parallel tracks, you have to kind of have a fairly large number of tools available before any of them are very valuable at all.
Yes. We developed 6 initial modules, which were inspired very much by kind of like standing on the shoulders of the Sandine IP. And the functions were arranged a little differently, and it was kind of optimized for an RGB workflow. There are quite a few modules that you need before everything starts to really come together. Like any modular synthesizer, but perhaps compounded even more for video. An image contains so much more information per the rate of time that you're receiving it than an audio signal does. And as a result, that can be directly translated to the complexity of the signals that you might want to come in. Like with an audio synthesizer, you might play a single note or two and adjust a filter cutoff, and it sounds very pleasant to your ear. Whereas on a video signal synthesizer, that would equate to just showing a blue bar and then turning the blueness up and down. It's not it's not as interesting. You have to have a greater complexity of signals going in.
Yeah, well, I have to admit that I even, this seems like something that is kind of difficult to intellectualize. It's especially, I'm thinking of it in terms of the fact that video has to assemble itself into a two-dimensional frame, where audio is just a single stream. And so it's a lot easier to take envelopes and LFOs and these kinds of things, in a stream of audio. It's a little easier to understand what the effect of these things is going to be. It's harder for me to wrap my head around what's going to happen as you do these effects and then you assemble them into this two-dimensional frame space.
I couldn't really conceptualize it until I'd already built something. And so all the cool stuff started happening once you start playing. But generally how I explain it is this. It comes down to frequency ranges. In audio, you have things in twos. You've got two ears, you've got stereo, you've got low frequency control voltage content, and you've got audio range frequency audio content. And generally, things happen within the audio range or they happen in the subsonic range. In video, you just add one more layer on top of that. You've got your below frame rate range, which coincidentally coincides with the audio's with the subsonic range. Because right. You think a video is 30 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're in PAL. Signals that are below your frame rate or that change slower than your frame rate are going to create animation across multiple frames. So in modular audio synthesis, you would typically refer to LFOs and envelopes as low frequency control voltage generators. In video, they become animators across multiple images. Now, once we get above frame rate, the video has scan. We don't have pixels in analog video. We have scan lines. Scan lines are the discrete unit, and that's like the TV starting at the left side of the screen and like printing the voltage of the video signal from left to right across the display. So we have 525 scan lines in every frame, and the 525 times 29.97 translates to a frequency of 15,734 kilohertz. So things that happen between the frame rate, that 30 hertz and that 15.734 kilohertz, are what I would call the vertical modulation range. And that roughly coincides with the audio range, which is interesting. And so things that happen between frame rate and the scan line rate are things that are going to create horizontal bars, or like a square wave within that range is going to create a repeating horizontal bars. And the number of bars is going to be determined by how close you get. More bars as you get closer to 15 kilohertz and less bars as you get closer to 30 frames per second. And then if you go below the frame rate, you've got strobing animation with that square wave. And then the third range, the one that doesn't coincide with anything your ears can perceive, is the actual video range, or the horizontal modulation range. These are things that would be digitized into actual pixels. They're things that happen within one scan line. So that's why we have an oscillator that goes over 2 megahertz. Generally, an analog television and standard definition signal isn't going to be able to display. Generally, the bandwidth is between 4 and 6 megahertz, depending on the transmission, before the resolution just gets too fine and gets filtered out. But there are no discrete units within a scan line.
Well, it's interesting because, certainly within the Max world, I do a lot of work with video, but it's very much pixel oriented. And I never really thought of that pixelation as being sort of like the equivalent of digital sampling of audio, but I see where it is in that there is this, in the analog video space, there is this sense of a continuum that doesn't really exist when you're working with digital video.
Yeah, I mean, within digital video, you're always working with geometric transformations. It's like you have this stable, still image. You can pause the video any point you want. You can freeze it. You can manipulate a little thing. You can tweak it here and there. Whereas analog video is living and breathing. It's like you're riding along with it, and it never stops. The same way audio does. Yeah,
well, that actually brings up kind of an interesting point, which is it strikes me that this kind of video system is very much a performative system where, to me, video has become almost obsessively editing oriented. It seems like this sort of returns video play to a real-time and performative kind of thing. Do you find that to be the case both for your play and work as well as what like your customers are doing?
So the question was.
The question is does this push people more into a performative mode in how they work with the system?
I think so. I think it's you're performing video when you're working with a modular video synthesizer. You're not. You're performing it. You're rehearsing it. You're not editing it. It's like It's more like you have a bunch of toys on the table that you're playing with, rather than manipulating things pixel by pixel. I mean, there's a place for both.
Sure. Well, so my question then would be, who do you find is most successful in a transition to like a modular video system like this? Is it people who already have a video background, or is it people who have some other background? Because I would think that sort of the modern video background doesn't really set you up very well to work with this system.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I asked myself that same question when I was designing the system initially, and obsessed over it a long time, about who would want to part with multiple thousands of dollars for this thing that does this. And I didn't really know that there would be anybody. And now we have probably over 150 system owners.
Oh, that's great. That's amazing. Well, I know of some people, and it seems like when folks get some facility with this system, and then they work with musicians or bands or whatever, there's a lot of interest in it because it is very much a different experience. Although, while it's a different experience, I want to go back to something that you talked about earlier, which is the Sandine image processor. That's Sandine, right?
Yes.
Yeah. As being a really influential thing. So, to a certain extent, while it's exciting and new and very different from what we see in most digital video work, it really is sort of like a throwback to the past. And I'm not sure that I even remember what the Sandine image processor did. Surely you have studied what these systems were about. Why don't you give us a kind of an overview of the things that you think are the significant historical systems that kind of led to the LZX system?
Sure. Before I answer that, I just wanted to go back to the last question a second.
Oh, okay.
You had asked what types of people coming at this have really gone really far with it, and I think the answer to that would be artists who are multidisciplinary visual artists, who have usually people who are primarily into video or visual art, but have a background or have experience with music and music making and audio synthesis. There's a lot of people that have come from the audio world and have gone really far, but the people I think really passionately pushing it as this whole new thing are the visual artists that have come to it from that angle.
Yeah, it's funny because it's hard now to realize how important the interdisciplinary thing is. It used to be that interdisciplinary was almost a bad word. It was like you're only interdisciplinary because you can't buckle down and work hard on whatever art form you should be working on.
Interesting.
And I find it really interesting that now, because of the access available to all these different art forms and art creation tools and art disciplines, that interdisciplinary turns out to be where you kind of want to lie. I mean, having skills in background in music, but in video, in art, but in coding, in electronics, all these different things allow you to move forward in a way that you couldn't if you had been laser focused on any one of those disciplines.
Right. Definitely. If I were to list off in my head the 10 most active members in the LZX community that put out the most work, that spend the most time on a daily basis with their systems and are constantly churning things out, probably 7 or 8 out of those 10 got into modular synthesis because of video synthesis and because of the LZX system from a visual artist's perspective.
It was the fact that it was available that drew them into modular systems.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the history of analog video synthesis, because it's a pretty rich space, and it's a pretty amazing space, but it's also a space that I think a lot of people felt was left behind, or that we had grown beyond, or whatever. You mentioned before the sanding image processor as being influential. What in particular about that system kind of inspired you, as well as what other systems or what other artists or developers kind of drove you and informed you of where to go?
From the beginning, I've always been inspired foremost by the devices and the kind of idea behind the devices, more than I have by the artwork created by them. I love video art. It's just the devices themselves are what became fascinating to me and what I had to create. The sanding was my first exposure to modular video synthesizer. There weren't a whole lot of modular pieces made. Well, there's probably a half dozen. The sanding IP was developed in the 60s, and I think it was University of Chicago. I don't remember the exact university name, but Dan modeled it after the Moog synthesizer that he had seen. He wanted to make a Moog synthesizer that processed images. So that's why he went with a similar format of patch cords and modular pieces. And I have to think about it for a second, but I think his was the only real truly modular in the way that we would think of a Eurorack modular today.
Right.
Video system. I mean, there were under 30 IPs built, and it was open source. It was Dan distributed the schematics in a big document. I think it's about between 20 and 30 people built them. The cost in today's dollars in parts to build a standard sanding image processor was about $17,000 to $18,000 in today's dollars.
Right.
Just for the parts, the electronic components to build one back then. Whereas now you can get an LZX system that overlaps all the same functional areas for around $5,000. That's why video art didn't take off in the sense you had to be in a university environment to afford even pieces to build something. But the IP had several different. I mean, you had an oscillator, you had a mixer, you had VCAs, you had some sort of specific. There was a solarization function called the function generator. There's differentiator, which is like a high pass filter with multiple cutoff inputs. An amplitude classifier. We've cloned the function generator and the differentiator, and they use upgraded op amps, but they're the exact same circuits, and those are available in the LZX lineup with Dan's blessing.
So Dan's still around?
Oh yeah, I haven't talked to him in several months, but I did a workshop in Chicago. I guess it would have been late 2011. And he attended the workshop. I was shaking. That was nervous.
That must have been awesome. Yeah.
He's a very kind person. I was very privileged to meet him and talk with him. He said that being there in that room with all of us video art, enthusiasts was like taking a time machine back 30 years to similar rooms in Chicago lofts.
Right. Well, what now? In talking with him or with others, do you feel like my sense in talking with some of the people that introduced video as an art form is that they felt like the world had walked away from their vision of art. Do you get that sense from Dan?
Well, I think Dan's been very active with the electronic visualization lab, all the way up through the present. I mean, after the IP, he went on to develop digital animation systems in the 80s and virtual reality systems in the 90s. So I don't get as much of a sense of that from him. Other pioneers that I've talked to definitely seem it's either one of two camps. It's yes a romanticism for that old style of processing, or on the other hand, it's a why would you want to do that old stuff kind of thing.
Yeah.
Why even bother? They just don't get it.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a good point because I've run into that as well. Why would you want to do that? Haven't we gone past it? Besides the sending image processor, can you think of any other hardware that you remember, like in your research or studying, that particularly stood out as important to you?
Sure, I'll briefly go through all the important ones. There's, of course, the Rodetra scan processor, which was a device that's a whole other can of video art worms, is vector synthesis using an XY display. That allows you to do geometric transformations analog. There's also the Scanimate system, which was developed for early computer animation in the 60s. If you've ever seen like an NBC Super Bowl logo from like spinning gold text from the early 70s, it was probably done on a Scanimate system.
Oh, okay.
But it was very much a modular analog computer for manipulating video. I don't think there's a video synthesizer that I haven't digested and studied as closely as possible, but there's those. There's kind of this, the sanding, and I would say the Hearn Video Lab, or the EAB Video Lab, was inspired by Buchla, and there were like two 4U rack panel modules, and it used banana jacks like the Buchla. It was modular, but there were only two modules.
Oh, sure, right.
And they weren't meant to be modular as in multiples of them so much. Mm-hmm. But it was very inspirational to me in that system probably embodies the closest to the way that I try to embrace interface and layout with my modules. and that it's like lots of little functional blocks, but with kind of a big picture in mind at the same time. Then there's the EMS Spectre. There are only a few of those built, and Richard Monkhouse designed that. I think they had the story goes that they had a huge stock of switching ICs that were very expensive at the time, left over from some audio synthesizer run that EMS had designed. So they told Richard to design a video synthesizer and see if they could do anything with that market using all these expensive switch ICs that they already had. So it's a patch programmable, like a patch matrix,
right,
and programmable type system. It's all based on hard-keyed shapes. So most of it's all 5-volt logic running around throughout the system. Very interesting, complex instrument, like the Video Lab, very modular, but, in a preset configuration. Lots of that. And some of the territory that the LZX system has not ventured into yet is in the range of, well, as far as releases, I've done a lot of prototypes, is video rate noise sources and texture generators, and random sources like random animation. And the EMS has a couple of very inspiring functions along those lines.
That actually brings up a question. One of the things I know for myself in my work, the different systems that I work with, whether it's the modular systems or the standard keyboard systems or digital systems, or in video, the variety of mechanisms I use there. One of the things I know is that there are some, that each environment makes certain things very easy and other things almost impossibly difficult. So, for example, in the music world or in the audio world, a modular system is really good if you want to play around with mad modulation, or if you want to grab onto things and control them. That's something that no other system really does a great job at. Conversely, repeatability, not a big winner in the modular world, right?
Right.
What within an analog video system, what would you say are the things that represent the things that are easier to do than in other systems, and what are the things that are more difficult to manipulate?
With video, you can pack so much information into an image that you can't pack as densely into an audio source, I think. Not that an audio signal isn't extremely complex. You just have more of a playground to play with. So going back, the infinite, the really complex modulation schemes that you would find in an audio system translate very well to video, because it doesn't have to sound good. So whenever you add a modulation source, you're adding a degree of visual complexity, and chances are it's going to look interesting. Whereas with audio, we're talking about more digital versus the analog. Video is used to being recorded and edited after the fact. Audio and music performance in general kind of has this the perception that the performance is the initial art form, the rehearsal and the performance of it. Whereas with video, especially like animation or abstract animation, it has a history of a little bit more tediously constructing every little bit of it frame by frame. So I don't think there's the same. People are more likely to do collage work with their video synthesizers than they are with their audio synthesizers, I think.
What do you mean by collage work?
Recording pieces and then using the recorded pieces to compose an artwork.
I see. Right. Now, one of the things when I look through the forum on Muff Wigglers, where people will post up their video snippets and stuff, One of the things I noticed is, first of all, and I have to say, this just sort of like knocks on the door of a dear love of mine, is there's a lot of people that are really get pulled into feedback mechanisms.
Oh, yes.
Which is clearly something that that this system would kind of preference.
Absolutely.
But also sort of like the abstract and abstract use of sort of like spatial color manipulation. That seems to be a real big thing. Is that something that you feel like the system sort of makes easier, makes more accessible?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, absolutely. Like if you're working in Photoshop, you kind of have to have the idea to do something before it happens. Whereas with a complex patch, you might just be a quarter of a knob turn away from something you would have never conceived of before. It's an exploratory process. I mean, the same as it is with an audio synthesizer. And it's pleasurable to sit down and use. There's not clicking on menus. There's just this kind of limited palette of functions in front of you. And, I get tired when I'm on the computer editing images or editing video, whereas I can sit in front of a cathode ray tube and the video synthesizer, and I'll just you start playing with it, and then eventually something happens, and then 10 minutes passes and you realize you've been just staring right at that screen for 10 minutes.
Sure, I hear that. That actually makes me want to know, though, do you actually have a special screen that you use for the output of this rather than digitizing it? Do you use like an old-style CRT screen?
Absolutely. It looks completely different, especially when photographed.
Oh, sure.
It's just way more immediate, especially when you're outputting a raw analog signal to an analog monitor. It's just going to happen in your eyes a different way. We're so used to seeing web video, and especially when it comes to like high intensity animation, color saturation, abstract images.
Right.
If you view those on YouTube, it's not going to look anywhere near the experience of sitting right in front of a big cathode ray and seeing the way the colors just kind of melt off the screen, and the way you can turn the saturation up in a way that your LCD monitor is never going to look like. Or it just feels different now. And with vector monitors, that's even more of a unique experience, because it just an analog vector monitor XY displaying like a rotating 3D shape.
It's crazy. I've experienced that in the past, and it's almost spooky, because the vector display somehow breaks through the two-dimensional nature of the screen in a way that a lot of three-dimensional high-end OpenGL processing doesn't seem to do. There was something magical about, some little cube on a vector screen that would rotate, and it looked magical.
Yeah, I mean, your eyes are picking up on things that you're not going to see otherwise. Yeah, it's I've been working with Ed the past several months on something of an analog 3D engine. It's a full XYZ three-dimensional to two-dimensional perspective transform, all using analog computing at video rate. So you can rotate, position, and size the input XYZ object anywhere in the 3D space as possible, and then you would display that on a vector monitor for rescanning. I'm really excited about getting some of the vector tools out. I've been reluctant to a little bit, simply because, you have to, if I'm going to sell a product that requires you to hunt down an old vector monitor, it's just a little tricky.
How difficult are those to find? They must be. Thankfully the community has really cataloged the good models,
and people, it's kind of a rite of passage within our little video synth scene right now is hunting down your vector monitor. Get your badge of pride.
Sure.
When you get your vector scan set up all figured out.
So where is the video synthesis community hanging out?
Muff Wiggler.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
Just okay.
Interesting. There's a Facebook group for Chris King's blog, Video Circuits. The community hasn't been as active this past year as it was the year before. Everybody's still busy doing stuff, or maybe I just haven't been around as much. I've had a pretty crazy year. But yeah, that's generally where we all hang out and share ideas.
Sure. So what is next for LZX? So you're playing around with these ideas with producing vector content.
Yes.
But do you have things that are going to be adding to the standard line, the visionary line, that it's going to enhance that world?
Well, yeah. We've had a big hit list so far. A lot of some of the things we've released so far have had kind of functional overlap in some ways with each other. But there's certain categories of processing that we haven't gotten to yet that I'm very excited to. One of them is digital frame buffers, which is, we've shied away from that because the analog stuff has been more important because you can't do the analog stuff on a computer, whereas
right.
the digital transformations you can. But still doing the digital transformations under full voltage control of all the parameters will be really cool.
Yeah.
And a big source of inspiration there would be units like the Ampex ADO frame buffer or the Fairlight CVI.
Right.
And so we want to get into that. I want to release a module specifically for driving a vector monitor. It's on my list.
Mm-hmm.
I'm beyond that. I'm redesigning some of the initial concepts behind the system into some more integrated modules. When I first started designing this, I was all about functional blocks and just getting as many functional blocks available so that people could use them like Legos and build whatever they wanted patch-wise. But I'm working now that I know that people want this thing and that there's a community built around it and that there's potential for it to expand and grow beyond that. I'm working on some more integrated devices. So, for example, I'm just putting the finishing touches on a module I've been working on for 2 years now with Ed, and it's a 2D shape generator. It's a primary shape generator with 8 voltage controllable parameters. But, it has controls for things like, 0-degree symmetry, 45-degree symmetry, rotation, position, logarithmic to exponential shaping over the curve of the edge of the shape.
Right.
More from like a square to a circle.
Mm-hmm.
And like size controls, border keying, and all these things that it would usually take several modules across multiple functional blocks to do something as simple as create a triangle on the screen and make it spin.
Right.
So basically the past 3 years, I feel like I've been designing a toolkit to play with, and that these existing designs are going to become the utility modules for a new generation of LZX modules that are more integrated and artistically focused. Artistically focused isn't a good word. It's just they're more usable for someone.
Well, it sounds like they're more goal designed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you ever worry about that being a trap though, or not really?
Oh, I do, because you don't want to defeat the point of having a modular system.
Right.
And that's why I get so OCD with these designs. I probably I mean, there's a balance of too outrageously like functional,
Right.
with every parameter patched out versus too simple. I mean, you don't want something that just has 3 buttons: circle, square, triangle. um, the goal with this module was to make it so that any shape could morph into any other shape
Sure.
that the module can create, and in a visually pleasing, symmetrical manner. So it's more about a clever arrangement of processing. It's an analog computer designed with a very, it's not a Liz's super spectacular color organ op art synthesizer. It's not an art piece in itself.
Right.
It's a compositional tool that has voltage control over the parameters. It's just the context. The parameters are contextualized.
Well, I think it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things I will say in looking over the work of people that have posted snippets and stuff is that you've designed a system that leaves plenty of allowance for the artist's voice. I mean, that's a badge of honor, because with something new and something where you're kind of designing from whole cloth, it has to be scary to worry about saying, well, what I've just done is make Liz's perfect instrument, and everyone else that does work on it is going to make a variation of Liz's work.
Right. Yeah, that's not what I wanted with the system. I wanted to approach reintroducing these modular video tools in a humble way that showed a lot of respect to where this art form originated and what it is trying to continue, rather than capitalize on it. And that would provide, just the functional building blocks. Even just a module that can convert any voltage into a video signal is pretty magical, I think. And that's where we started. Nothing like that existed.
Right.
That video artist could just buy,
Right. Well, I'm just I think that's one of the things, whether you talk about the Eurorack systems or modulars in general, if you look back to what you used to have to do to put together a system like this, like you talked about with the Sandine, where it was like you'd get the book of circuits, then you'd go and buy parts, and that was the path to getting into video synthesis. I mean, it's pretty amazing now that you can sort of like pull together pieces off the shelf and put something useful and interesting together. That's a pretty big swing.
Right. And the Eurorack world is just amazing. Everybody has a very much ownership over their instruments, while at the same time kind of supporting this community of, effectively, folk artists.
Right.
Creating these instruments.
Right. So let's take a look at the bigger picture and the future picture. Where do you see this going? I mean, first of all, it sounds like you had to do, it was almost a struggle for you to really decode the video signal and be able to work with it in a useful way. Do you think that the domain is so difficult that it defeats sort of like the typical DIY hardware hacker kind of thing? Or is there a way to sort of like bring those skills to bear on stuff like this?
Well, that's why I designed the core modules with an open interface the way that I did. Like the current modules that are the core of the system are the sync generator module and the encoder module. And once you have those, all the hard stuff is out of the way.
Sure.
You don't have to design an NTSC sync generator and worry about color subcarriers. You just have to worry about plugging 1 volt voltages into red, green, and blue. And then you can also translate external video signals into that 1 volt signals where you can run them to your effects pedals or whatever you want to do. So I wanted to create an interface where people could use their hardware hacking skills to do things to a video signal or to the creation of a video signal without having to worry about the interface or whether they're going to glitch out the projector at their gig or something like that.
So you've kind of developed a standard of interfacing with video. Do you think that there are going to be other developers that are going to embrace this standard and build off of the work that you've done?
Well, I hope so. I mean, that's the point of it. After all, Nick has designed a couple modules.
That's the brown shoes only stuff, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And there's 4MS is working on a version of their pingable envelope generator called the pingable animation generator that does frame synchronized envelope animations and cycling animations. And I've worked with Dan to kind of optimize that design. And, hopefully we'll see more people getting into designing some more complex mega modules that kind of complete whatever vision they have that the system should be able to do. I think we'll probably see the system really mature into that over the next couple of years. And the more integrated modules will bring some, you don't have to understand the frequency ratios and the oscillators the way that you currently do,
right,
in order to create artwork. It's not as cryptic.
Well, it seems like a really exciting thing. It looks like there's another mortgage in my future as I move into this. It's fantastic. It's very exciting, and I really appreciate the time you took to talk me through through what you're doing and what the environment is like. I think our listeners are going to eat this up. But thank you very much for your time, and have a great day.
Thanks very much, Darwin. It's a pleasure.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
And how's that for a pile of information? It was amazing. She took very good care of me as I walked down the street of learning a little bit about a completely new environment. As always, I would ask that if you find this or any of the other podcasts interesting, that you share it with your friends, put postings on forums, do whatever you can. Let's get the listenership up. As always, if you need to get in touch with me, you can hit me at ddg@cycling74.com. Look forward to hearing from you. And until next week, goodbye.